The reviews for Pikmin 4 have came out recently, and it's sitting at a very solid 88, which is not just great for Pikmin, but that's great for Nintendo. But this isn't new for Nintendo. Ever since the Nintendo Switch era has begun, Nintendo has been dropping banger after banger titles, games that release in the high 80s and low 90s to mid 90s, pretty much consistently throughout the entire run of the Nintendo Switch. The Nintendo Switch as a platform has been both critically and commercially successful for Nintendo. And a lot of people love it, but with that same love, it's always going to come the critiques, it's always going to come the hate. There's a lot of people who look at Nintendo Switch games, who look at the Nintendo Switch hardware, and ask themselves, I don't like this. How in the hell can anyone else like this? That's called biased. Whether you like it or not, everyone has a bias. Whether you're a fanboy or not, you carry your own bias on games that you've played and you liked, and it controls the way you choose to buy things and the way you choose to consume media. This brings us to our topic of today. Nintendo Switch, all the games on this platform at some point have been subjugated to something called the Nintendo bias. It was really heavy when Tears of the Kingdom released. People were a little upset, saying, how can this game that barely touches 720p, can't touch 30 frames per second, get all these 10 out of 10 raving reviews, one of the greatest games of this era? How does that happen on decade-old hardware, on a game that's 720, on a game that doesn't hit 30 frames per second? It baffles the mind of many people. So when they don't understand it because they themselves don't like it, it makes it harder for them to understand why so many people do like it. Which then they create this narrative saying that, well, they have a bias. They give Nintendo brownie points because they're Nintendo, because it's Zelda, because it's Pikmin, whatever the heck. Well, I want to talk about a couple things in this specific idea. One, touching mainly on the Nintendo bias, but bias overall within the reviewing committee, within the reviewing group of people. And that is the fact that, yes, there is a Nintendo bias, but there's also a PlayStation bias. There's an Xbox bias. There's a bias among the reviewers because they're human beings, and as much as they want to try to separate their objective views from their subjective views, ultimately we all pull from our experiences in the past, whether it be gaming, movies, food, whatever. You know what you've liked, so you know what you're gonna like. It's called bias. You go into these things with a certain expectation, whether it's a decade-old franchise like something like The Legend of Zelda, whether it's something like Pikmin where you've never really played a Pikmin game before, and this might be the first time that they played a Pikmin game. They're still gonna pull from their experiences of gaming to help determine whether or not this is considered a good game in their opinion. Hey there you guys, my name is Christian, and in this video, again, I just want to touch on the bias within the reviewing committees, within the reviewing groups, whatever the heck you want to call them. If you guys like this type of video, do me a favor and like this video. Please consider subscribing, as it does help me out tons. And without wasting any more time, let's get into this video. The big Nintendo bias that I heard getting thrown around recently was mainly on Tears of the Kingdom and Final Fantasy 16. When Tears of the Kingdom came out, people were upset that this game wasn't being graded on the same scale that some other games around its time were. Games like Jedi Survivor, games like Redfall. When Redfall came out, they were marked hard on their performance, on some of their graphical hitches, but also just as games. And we saw it with Redfall, where as a game, it was a very bad game. Alongside its graphical hitches, alongside its poor performance, all of that led to a really low, 56 or whatever it ended up with. Jedi Survivor was a great game, great story, but ultimately it couldn't get past the performance issues. So it didn't get into the 90s that a lot of us probably think it should have been, and instead it landed somewhere within the 80s, which is still a great score. But then we get Tears of the Kingdom. And Tears of the Kingdom reviews at a ridiculously high 96. This is a game that struggles to hit 30 frames per second and majority of the time runs at 720p. So again, this baffles people as to why Tears of the Kingdom is rated so highly and isn't graded on the same scale as maybe some other games, maybe a game on the PlayStation 5 or a game on Xbox Series X and S. Well, there's a bias in there, yeah, sure. People are gonna feed off their nostalgia. People are gonna, remember their times. Tears of the Kingdom is gonna call back to those things. But so did Jedi Survivor. There is a bias at play. But alongside that bias also comes expectations, I think. Whenever you get a new entry into a storied franchise, there comes a level of expectation that it now has to hit. And Tears of the Kingdom rose to those expectations. Breath of the Wild set wildly high expectations that a lot of us didn't think were going to be possible. And Tears of the Kingdom went above and beyond more than they had to, which gave people a lot more of a shock factor, which is kind of crazy because Breath of the Wild already gave such a huge shock factor. So for you to be able to do that twice within the same franchise is impressive. Alongside that, you also have the expectation of the hardware. The Nintendo Switch, no one buys a game on a Nintendo Switch expecting 4K 60. No one buys a hardware on a Nintendo Switch expecting 1080 60 sometimes. Majority of the times, you're just glad that these games run, and that's the expectation Nintendo kind of has right now. You expect to play a fun game. You expect to play a game that is going to have its graphical hitches. So, with all that being said, it's not too much of an issue. But if you get a game on PC, if you get a game on a PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X or S, where you put some real money down, you expect a little bit more on your return. You expect a little bit more for your investment. So if I was to sit down and buy a game for $70 on $500 hardware, $800 hardware, whatever the heck, however expensive your hardware is, yeah, I expect that game to perform better than hardware that's $300. It's just expectations are set. Something else that I think people kind of seem to forget with expectations is expectations of the game. People applauded Xenoblade Chronicles 3 when it received an 89 Metacritic score, a phenomenal score for a relatively newer franchise. Xenoblade Chronicles has been around since the Wii. And yeah, Xenoblade Chronicles the original set really high standards that up until Xenoblade Chronicles 3 haven't really been met, and Xenoblade Chronicles 3 finally met those expectations. Now, Final Fantasy 16 got an 87, 2 scores below Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Final Fantasy is a decade-old storied franchise where people expect 90s and above, even if the last couple games haven't really hit those 90s, those highs that Final Fantasy from the Super Nintendo hit, the highs that Final Fantasy from the PlayStation hit, from PlayStation 2. Final Fantasy is such a landmark franchise that the world stops to pay attention whether or not you care about the games or not. You want to see what that score is because deep down we're either rooting for it or we're rooting against it. But a lot of us kind of want Final Fantasy to be this 90 upper echelon game that it once was. So even though it's only a 2-point difference, that 87 feels ridiculously low for what we want a Final Fantasy game to hit. And Xenoblade Chronicles 3's 89 is ridiculously high for what people can come to expect of a Xenoblade Chronicles game. Another thing you guys gotta understand too is that I think the scales are different for specific games. For example, Final Fantasy 16 is at an 87. Yet still people are looking at it as a Game of the Year contender. Pikmin 4 on the other hand hits an 88. Nobody's talking about that getting any nomination. It very well could if you want to just go by Metacritic scores, but it's not in the conversation. Games that haven't even released yet, like Starfield, are in the Game of the Year conversation without even releasing. Yet Pikmin 4 isn't, and it released at a very, very good score of 88. So yeah, that expectation does matter, because that 88 for Pikmin 4 isn't the same as the 87 for Final Fantasy 16. They're two completely different games graded on different scales. It's just what it is. If you were to get like a sports game, or if you were to get like a racing game that score usually really high, those really highs are considered different than an RPG scored at a mid tier, because you're in different categories. You're not competing necessarily in the same race, even though you're all video games. And I know that's a weird thing for people to wrap their head around, because in their head, they're like, video games are all the same medium. They should be graded on the same scale. But that's just not really how it works when we have different genres, different budgets, different expectations. For example, a perfectly well-crafted indie game is less likely to win Game of the Year than a more rough around the edges AAA blockbuster game. That's just the way life is, unfortunately. Obviously, that isn't always the case. Games like Hades 2 have won Game of the Year. It's not that necessarily a certain game can't win, right? But like Forza a couple years back was one of the highest rated scores of that year, and it wasn't really in the Game of the Year conversation. But games like God of War, Horizon, spectacle style games are always going to be in that conversation. It's another reason why like a Call of Duty can review really highly, but no one's ever going to say that's going to be in the Game of the Year conversation, just because it's not doing anything we haven't seen yet. It's more of an annual release. Same things to like your Maddens or your NFLs. Games aren't graded on the same scale, whether you like it or not. Whether they're the same medium or not, they're different genres, different budgets, different expectations, and different bias going into it. And that's one of the things that, again, I think people put too much levity on what a review score is. Instead of just looking at the Metacritic score, I implore you all to try to read the review at least a little bit. At least understand why the score is that score. I remember when Tears of the Kingdom came out, it reviewed very highly. All the reviews were giving it 9s out of 10s, 10s out of 10s, some 8 out of 10s. And there was that one like 60 out of 100 or whatever. And the guy was essentially saying how he didn't like Breath of the Wild, and he was hoping Tears of the Kingdom would do something to bring The Legend of Zelda closer back to what it once was. And instead they drifted more towards the Breath of the Wild side. So for him, he did not like that. And he very specifically mentions that this is his bias, essentially. He frames this whole review on the fact that he doesn't like this style of game. This game wasn't good for him. That's his opinion. That's his review. That's the whole purpose of reviews, is to get people's opinions. But nobody read that part. All they said was he gave Tears of the Kingdom a 6 out of 10. That is ridiculous. That is horrendous. That is despicable. And they dragged him. I think unfairly, but it is what it is. So I think people got to stop paying attention to the very specific Metacritic score or the very specific just number attached to the review, and pay attention to the review, the words, what they're trying to tell you. Because a lot of times that's going to tell a bigger story than what the actual review score is, if that makes sense. Overall, yes, there is a bias in reviews. That just comes with the fact that we're human beings, and we all are going to pull from our past experiences to help judge this new experience as worthy or not worthy, as good or bad, as mid or whatever. And that's not bad. We come to expect that. The one thing that I do, again, ask everybody is just make sure that you guys are reading the reviews a little bit and paying a little bit more attention as to what they're trying to say and why, how they came to the conclusion, whether it be their specific bias, whether they expected more, whatever the case it is. There's always going to be a reason why that number is attached to the review. So, again, just do a little bit harder work and pay attention to that part, and stop getting mad that certain games review higher than others. That doesn't mean as much if you actually read the words. All in all, that's all I have on this specific topic. Let me know down below what you guys think. If there's games that you think should review better, or if we should change our whole way of reviewing games. But all in all, these are my final thoughts. I'll see you guys in the next video.